It is one of the most controversial issues of our time and one of the most important. Darwin's theory of evolution has been the focus of a week-long documentary by PBS. Tonight, before we present the final segment entitled What About God?, join us for a one-hour discussion during Evolution, a Local Perspective. Our panelists are Carol Shepard, an assistant professor of entomology at Washington State University. Carol also teaches an honors program class on evolution. We also welcome Steve Meyer, an associate professor of philosophy at Whitworth College. Steve is active in the Discovery Institute, an organization that supports an alternative to evolution called intelligent design. We're also pleased to have Professor John Downey of Gonzaga University. John is in the theology department at GU and is interested in issues that relate to science and religion. Steve Meyer, I'd like to ask you first. You're not a fan of Charles Darwin or of evolution. Tell me why.
Well, there's a lot I admire about Darwin, actually, in the way he formulated his arguments. But I think there's a fundamental tenet of Darwinism that I disagree with, and that is the idea that natural selection, his key mechanism, can substitute for the role of an actual intelligent designer. Biologists almost universally, both in the 19th century and now, recognize that living things appear as if they were designed. But for the Darwinists, the key word there is appear. The idea is that natural selection can explain away that appearance without any actual guidance or direction. And so I represent and am active in my own research in formulating and advocating a view that says, no, there is actual evidence of real design. When we see things like little molecular motors in cells and the DNA software code and the complex organs and body plans that we see in animals, these are things that natural selection cannot entirely explain or satisfactorily explain, and that there is a need to invoke real or actual intelligence in the history of life to explain that. That doesn't necessarily rule out belief in evolution by certain sorts of definitions of the word. The idea of change over time, of course, many of us accept, but the really strong form of Darwinism, the idea that natural selection can function as a designer substitute, is something that I do reject, and instead favor the idea that there's evidence of real design, not just apparent design in biology.
Carol Shepard, what do you think about that? Is that something that you would be willing to integrate into your curriculum at WSU?
I would be willing to integrate it only in the sense, in a science course, only in the sense of examining what we think about evolution, that is, what scientific evidence has shown us regarding evolution, how our views of that might have been refined and modified, and what evolution is as a scientific theory. I would then use that information and contrast it in the classroom with what creation science is, and I would probably argue that creation science as such is a misnomer, because we as scientists recommend or recognize certain strictures that science operates within, and we would argue that creation science as such has not yet achieved that status.
I just want to make sure, so you're suggesting that what Steve Meyer is presenting is in fact creation science, is that correct?
Well, that's a good question, Steve. There's a real spectrum of views of creation science, and Steve has, I think, a more moderate view. There are people who might subscribe to a young Earth view, that is, that the Earth and what we know about radiometric dating is incorrect, and that the Earth, rather than being 4.5 billion years old, is, or thereabouts, life on Earth is actually more like a few thousand years old, perhaps. So you have that end of the spectrum, and then you have people who would subscribe to an older Earth, but might see a supreme being as having more of a hand in it. And so there's this range, without going into all of those. There's certainly within the perhaps umbrella of creation science a range.
Steve, are you comfortable with that description?
No, I think we'd make a distinction between creation science and the theory of intelligent design, and also challenge the idea that design is not detectable scientifically. I think that's at the root of Carol's point about the rules of science. One of the design theorists, such as myself, are interested in the evidence that points to intelligence. Things like these motors and the presence of information in biological cells, for example. But we also are interested in challenging the rules of science that have precluded, since the late 19th century, scientists from making arguments of that sort. These were very common arguments made by leading scientists at the time in the 19th century, people like Louis Agassiz, a leading paleontologist. And they're coming back in because of some of the things that are being discovered, the immense complexity that you find within a cell, circuits and software and machines and these sorts of things, all on a miniaturized scale. So we're able to detect intelligence in other fields, like in archaeology. You see inscriptions, you don't infer that wind and erosion were responsible, you infer an intelligence. And so we think that is a scientific inference that can be made.
We do have a lot of different opinions and viewpoints on this particular issue, and Galileo had the audacity to suggest that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Are there parallels, and maybe there are none, but are there parallels in that debate and the debate that's currently going on about evolution and the start of life?
I think there are some parallels, just parallels, not identical. And the reason I say that is because most people don't understand, haven't studied that conflict, and don't understand what it was about. They think it was a conflict between religion and science. That's not true. They may have a default position that Christianity or the Catholic Church is consistently against science. That's not true. Historical study will not bear that out. The basic position over the years, the sweep, without just focusing on limited examples, is that Christian churches have supported science. It was in the core curriculum of medieval universities, all of which were Christian. The Galileo case itself was a case of culture conflict. Galileo wanted to talk about science, a new science. And other people wanted to talk about the Aristotelian science with a different notion of proof. So the real fight was not if faith and reason should be reconciled. That's a given in the medieval Catholic Church. Both Galileo and the people that put him on trial agreed on that. But which science shall you use? The new empirical science or the more deductive science? So it was really a fight about Aristotle. Aristotle was the dominant figure. So all I would point to is it is important, no matter where you are on the evolution question, to not think that overall, well, you're a Christian, therefore you don't support. Well, I mean, we have a science teacher right here. We have proof, okay. And I just think people, I even had one teacher tell me, oh, well, it's too bad that the Catholic Church tortured and murdered Galileo. No. Well, it's true that he was put under house arrest and so on.
Steve Meyer, talk a little bit more about the concept of intelligent design. It's something that up until this program came along I had never heard of. How long has it been around?
Well, it's been around since the Greeks, really. I mean, the great debate in Western philosophy and science from the very beginning was, are we the product of an undirected material process, or are we the product of an intelligent or the products of mind? And Plato and Aristotle sided more with the latter, and the materialists among the Greeks were with the former idea. So this was a debate in the period of early modern science. People like Newton were very favorable to the design hypothesis, and when Darwin came along, part of his purpose was to show that you didn't need to invoke actual intelligent design to explain the complex things we see around us today. And what's been going on in the last 10 to 15 years is there is a growing movement of scientists who question that Darwin was able that Darwin succeeded in explaining away that appearance with his mechanism of natural selection, and that with the immense complexity that we're finding in biological systems, that real design is back as an explanation.
Carol, do you go along with that there's a growing number of scientists who are questioning this?
No, I guess I would might argue with the idea of growing. And I suppose I would also argue with the idea that Darwin maybe set out to do this. What really happened was that Darwin, on his trip from the Beagle, which was 5 years around the globe, when he set out on set sail on the Beagle, he was in fact a subscriber to the theories or the idea of natural theology, which was put forth by William Paley in 1802. And this was the view of this is actually, in my opinion, the roots of intelligent design. What Paley used a watch metaphor, it's often quoted, and the idea there was that if you stumbled upon a watch out in nature, you would recognize right away that it was not a part of nature, and indeed that it was so complex that it must have a designer. What happened with Darwin was, in this course of that 5-year voyage, he recognized that there were things he was not able to account for on the basis of natural theology. And hence came his 20-year struggle to deal with what he was seeing and how to put it out.
We have a couple of calls from viewers at home. We also have a question from one of the folks in our audience. Please tell us who you are and go ahead with your question.
Hi, I'm Joanna from Washington State University, and I have a question for the Intelligent Design panel member. I'm curious, from the viewpoint of intelligent design, how do you reconcile structures in human anatomy, such as vestigial structures like the appendix or the transitory appearance of gill slits during development, or aspects of human anatomy which could be considered downright bad design, like the inguinal canal? How can these things occur if humans were developed from some perfect design or an intelligent design?
Steve Meyer, I think that question is...
Well, I think design theorists make a distinction between, we don't say that everything is perfect in nature, and we make a distinction, and I think this is part of our research program, to distinguish between things that the aboriginal design that you see in organisms and things that might have decayed or degraded over time. I have a friend down at the University of Idaho named Scott Minnick, a microbiologist, who works on these fascinating little motors, molecular motors that drive the bacterial flagellum. And Minnick has learned recently that there are cells that have only parts of these motors, and that that mutations have shut down the assembly instructions for the rest of the parts. And it turns out that this little critter that has this mutation in it is the bacterium that's responsible for the plague. That this perfect machine, or very well-designed machine, has had its assembly instructions disrupted, and as a result, it no longer functions in a way that's optimal for the organism, and it's certainly harmful to us. So we don't say, as the 19th century natural theologian said, everything is perfect, this is the best of all possible worlds. Instead, we see evidence of design and subsequent decay of that original design, and that I think can be incorporated into a theological framework. But that's simply a matter of observation in the biological world. So we see both of those things at work.
Can you, as the caller stated, can we make theology and science coexist?
Steve, could I jump in and have a crack at that one?
Sure.
Just, because I think it's important to define some of these terms. Can you merge a meaningful form of theism or creation, the idea of creation, with the idea of evolution? It depends on how you define the term evolution, for starts. Because evolution means many different things, even in the technical literature. It can mean simply change over time. It can mean Darwin's universal common ancestry thesis, the idea that all the living forms we see today evolved from one or very few simple forms. And it can also mean, thirdly, the idea that everything that we see here evolved as a result of a purely natural mechanism, namely natural selection or some other version of that, and that is sufficient to suffice for the appearance of design that we see in the universe. Now, I think you can merge easily the first two modes the first two definitions of evolution within a theological framework, but I think it's theologically problematic and scientifically difficult to say, to affirm the latter. That is to say, you can't say that God designed the universe through a mechanism that is undirected and undesigned. I mean, that's contradictory. So there, I think there is a necessary tension. Do you have a real designer or a designer substitute? You've got to, there, I think you have to choose.
We're going to know, if evolution is true, is there a God? If evolution is true, then there is no God, because Bible clearly teaches that God created the heavens and the earth, and that evolution and the Bible are essentially contradicting each other. Carol, what do you think about that?
Well, I guess it's a question of, in the sum total of whether one is going to take the Bible literally. And I read a wonderful quote the other day that something like, the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, but not how the heavens go. And I really like that, because I think that the Bible can be used, and is used, by many people to guide them through life so that they're good people. And we all want to be good people. I want to be a good person too, and I'm sure that all of my colleagues on this panel do. But whether or not we need to take the Bible literally in science is another matter, and that I would disagree with.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that one? Steve Meyer?
I think, again, on both sides of this issue, it's important to define terms. Certainly, if we mean by evolution change over time, there's absolutely no conflict in that concept of evolution with biblical teaching. I think there is, however, not just in biblical teaching, but in the classical theistic worldview, the understanding that in the universe there is evidence of design, and that results from a mind that was prior to matter, that matter has been shaped by mind. And so that I think is something that is essential to a theistic worldview. And insofar as Darwinism challenges that, I think there is a tension that has to be addressed head on.
My question is for Steve. You seem pretty eager to define terms, yet I'm not really sure where intelligent design stands. Is that only from a Christian viewpoint? I mean, do you guys incorporate evolution, or do you believe in a young Earth, or do you believe that it's a mixture? I know you say that you believe that there was, something in addition, I suppose, to evolution, but do you incorporate evolution? And
Again,
in what sense do you?
Yeah, thanks. Again, it depends on what you mean by the term and who you're talking to. I mean, we have a number of scientists who are arguing for design who are not themselves personally religious. They see evidence for an intelligence, but are willing to leave the question who or what, what is the nature of the intelligence unanswered. We see this all the time. You may have seen the movie Contact, where the scientist gets a signal coming in from space, and she determines that the signal is actually the prime number sequence. It's information rich. It's a radio signal that's loaded with information, and she then infers, hey, there's an intelligent source to this. So we can often identify that something has issued from an intelligence without knowing who the intelligence is. And so there are many scientists who are seeing the hallmarks of intelligence in the cell, for example, or in these fine-tuning parameters in physics that the gentleman mentioned earlier, and who are willing to leave the question, yeah, it looks like there's an intelligence, but leave the second question of who unanswered. And in fact, I don't think it can be fully answered from within science. So, yeah. So as far as what do we, there are differences of opinion among design theorists about how much of, which of the other different meanings of evolution also can be incorporated into that viewpoint. Some people believe that the universal common ancestry is true, but there's a design process of unfolding. Other people believe that there are separate, discrete interventions of information in the history of life, and so that you have parallel lines of descent within the history of life, and they draw support from that for that belief in the fossil record, for example, things like the Cambrian explosion. And so there's diversity of opinion.
This is for Carol. I wonder if science is inquiry into empirically based questions, things that have falsifiable evidence. Is it an attack on the scientific enterprise to demand that science accept ultimate causation and ultimate sorts of things, phenomena that have nothing to do with what's testifiable and verifiable by the empirical method?
Well, there's some people who spend a lot of time thinking about this subject, don't they? Go ahead, Carol.
Get them up here.
I would, and I'm sure that Steve would answer this, well, I'm pretty sure Steve would answer this differently. I would say that the onus, the way the scientific enterprise as a process works, the onus is on the person putting forth a new idea to generate the hypothesis, to run the experiments, to see if the hypothesis has some validity, to publish it, to put it out there for others to scrutinize. We saw a beautiful example with Pons and Fleischmann of what happens when that process is short-circuited. And for those of you who don't remember, Pons and Fleischmann were the ones that had the cold fusion story. Yeah. They went to the press with it before ever going into a peer-reviewed journal. And in fact, scientists were literally looking at the pictures of these men, the Pons and Fleischmann, with their little apparatus, trying to figure out what the size of it was from their hands, measuring the size of a hand and then trying to look at the size of the apparatus to test whether what they were saying was in fact valid. So the point being, when we have something that we challenge, and science accepts challenges all the time, but the person putting, or people or group, putting it forth, the onus, the burden is on them to put it forward, to defend it, such as it is, if I can use that word, and then to stand up to scrutiny. That's how science works.
Steve Meyer, do you buy that?
Well, I do agree that scientific ideas must be tested, but they're tested in different ways depending on the discipline. And my doctoral dissertation was actually on the method of the method of reasoning that Darwin used in The Origin of Species and other evolutionary sciences. And it's clear what historical scientists are trying to do is to reconstruct the past based on the clues that we have in the present. So they're reasoning from clues back to causes. They're reasoning much more like detectives, and they judge their competing hypotheses by which best explain the evidences that we see. And so in the debate over design or Darwinism, the question is, you have to assess, well, based on what we know about the way the world works, the cause and effect structure of the world, which theory best explains these certain hallmarks that I would argue are pointing to design. So I would say that both approaches to the question are using the same method of reasoning, and they're coming to different conclusions. They're not testing in a laboratory, repeatable sense. Rather, they're testing their ideas by comparing the explanatory power of the different hypotheses. And it's there that I think design derives its great support, because we see intelligent agents in our experience producing certain sorts of things, informational codes, for example, or little machines, and we're finding those same kinds of things in biology. So I think that is a testable idea, but in the way that's appropriate to the historical sciences, not the laboratory sciences.
30-second response, Carol.
I would disagree totally with that, because evolution as a theory should be predictive, and we should be able to generate hypotheses and test them, and scientists do this every day.
During the evolution process, Darwin pointed out natural selection and cell phones were survival of the fittest. Natural selection and survival of the fittest. Someone forgot to turn off the phone in the studio, which is what we're referring to. Survival of the fittest, which allowed us to continue to exist and further progress over many years into another species. Why then are there any species still here with us if we evolved from the apes? Anybody want to take a run at that?
I'd be happy to take a stab at that.
Okay.
One. Let's let Steve go first.
That's your burden of proof to bear.
Okay. Well, it's a great question, and in fact, we can even make it a bigger question, which is, the number of species that are on Earth living at the moment is actually perhaps 1% of all of those that have ever lived over time. So maybe we should ask the question, why so many species have gone extinct over time. It's another way of thinking about it, I think, to account for all the species that have gone extinct. Now, and there have been major mass extinctions, in my opinion, well documented from fossil evidence. At the same time, I think the question stems from not having perhaps an appreciation for how evolution is seen as working, and that is it's a constant branching, and certain lines may die off and other lines may flourish, and it's going to depend at a given point in time on the conditions. And by conditions, I don't just mean environmental. It can be any of a number of factors: predators, prey, interactions. All sorts of things can come into play at that point in time for that given organism in its own little space that we would call a niche. And so over time, many will go extinct. And so life is extraordinarily diverse because there are many niches, but also not everybody can hang out in the same niche.
Steve, what do you think about that?
I agree with that. I don't think there's any problem for Darwinism explaining extinction, generally speaking. The greater problem is the origin of new form and structure. Your previous questioner alluded to the origin of fishes. Well, we now know just recently, recent discoveries, that fishes go all the way back to the beginning of the middle Cambrian. They're in the so-called Cambrian explosion. Prior to that time, we have billions of years of Earth history in which we have only one-celled organisms, sponges, and very simple, they're called ediacaran fauna. Nothing like a fish. Where does that new structure come from? Where does the new information required to build an organism like that come from? That's the real problem that Darwin wanted to address in The Origin of Species and still remains unaddressed by modern evolutionary theory.
Our question this time comes from Steve Meyer. I'm sorry, it's to Steve Meyer. It's from Greg Gibson in Calgary.
It's not fair.
Yeah, it's not.
Ask yourself a question.
No, you want it.
There are no.
Yeah, that's right.
There are no plants here. That's right. It says that Mr. Russell argued that the introduction of God into things we don't understand added nothing to our overall knowledge. Now, is Steve and his intelligent design notion not doing the same thing? Steve, how would you answer that?
This to me again?
Yes, please.
Well, you had a cell phone ring there a few minutes ago, and anyone who knows anything about the complexity of that object would immediately infer that an intelligence had been responsible for it. That's not a so-called God of the gaps argument. It's not an intelligence of the gaps argument. That's just good reasoning from what we know about the way the world works. If you had an archaeologist who came across an inscription in rock and inferred that it was an intelligence, you wouldn't say that, well, that's a scribe of the gaps argument. You'd say that's good reasoning. You know, we know that only intelligent agents produce information. So when we find information in biology, we're not invoking God to cover ignorance, but rather we're invoking an intelligence as an explanation because of what we know about the way the world works, what causal processes produce information and which don't. So it's not that kind of an argument.
Well, which knowledge are you got to hang on till I can get you the microphone. Please wait till I can get you the microphone, and I can get this over
We'll
to
talk
you.
after.
Yeah, you can also talk afterwards. Go right ahead. Tell us who you are.
I'm Robert, and he asked the caller asked what information, what predictive power does an intelligent designer add to what we can empirically observe?
Well, there are predictive consequences of design theory, but I think I need to challenge the premise of the question first. I don't think that every theory in science is primarily judged by its predictive power. I think Darwinism was judged successful because of its explanatory power. Darwin had a suite of evidences, biogeographical distribution, vestigial structures, homology, that he could explain well by his theory of universal common descent. And it was the explanatory power of his theory that helped win the day. So historical theories in particular are notoriously lame when it comes to making predictions. We're not going to predict the future, for example, even if we accept Darwinism. Rather, they're ex post facto, after the fact, reconstructions of the past. They do a good job of explaining, not predicting. It's a different standard of evidence when you're talking about historical reasoning in science. So I think that's the wrong standard to apply.
Carol, it looks like you'd like to follow
I just
that.
want to say a quick thing, and that is that I would, with all due respect, disagree greatly with that. And the reason is, I feel that one of the most important aspects of evolution as a structure within which all of biology works, a framework that is, that it's extraordinarily predictive. And in fact, when people take flu shots, the CDC looks at what's going on with the evolution of various viruses and then designs a flu shot. And when drugs are made, they're designed. Designer drugs means they know something about how they're going to work. So it's extraordinarily predictive because we can use models, so-called lower life forms of insects and cell lines and bacteria and things of this sort. And based on those results, we predict how it's going to come out. We don't just do experiments blindly.
We are quickly running out of time, and I want to try and get to a couple of more calls that we've had. And one of them is from a young woman in Spokane. Krista Evans is in the 8th grade, and she asked, and John, I want to address this question to you. Why is evolution taught in school as the only origin of human race if it is just a theory? What do you think about that?
Well, it's not just a theory. I mean, it's not for me. I feel like I'm the puppet of somebody or something, but I mean, there's people who can explain this better, but it's not just a theory. That's a word that people play on when they argue against evolution. They use that as a kind of trick word. But really, they say, oh, it's just one of the theories. Oh, no. No. It's a whatever counts as, it's one of the things that scientists are the most sure of. It is a theory, but it is one of the things that scientists are most sure of. It's a theory because science is not facts. Science is a method. And so the method can always produce, it's a self-correcting method, so it can always produce other results, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a couple of important things that I would just, so the reason, why is it taught? Because it is the best scientific theory. Creationism is not a scientific theory.
Yeah.
Well,
No, go ahead.
I know that Steve doesn't agree, but I'm just saying what I think.
Sure, absolutely.
So it turns around method, not facts. That's what makes something a science, is the method. In fact, scientists, statistically, in their laboratories are mostly wrong, which doesn't bother them.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that we're advocating at Discovery Institute is that in the public schools, as well as on public television, that we teach the controversy. I mentioned that there was this statement signed by 100 scientists that came out yesterday questioning the creative power of natural selection. That's a very significant thing. Students need to know that there are scientists who disagree with their textbooks. They need to know about factual errors that persist in some textbooks, things like the Haeckel embryo pictures that you see in many of the current textbooks. I think Darwinism should be taught, but the full range of scientific opinion about the subject should be taught as well. Scientists who disagree, scientists who come to different conclusions, scientists who may hold a minority or heterodox view. So there's no reason that students are mature enough to learn about the controversy. So rather than telling them what the answer is, we need to tell students about the range of positions, why people hold different positions. That's a liberal arts approach and also a very scientific approach, because controversy does exist within science.
What things in nature would have caused natural selection to happen?
Well, natural selection is going on all the time. And that is the phenotype, what we see expressed in an individual, whether it's myself or a plant or whatever it is, there's inherent variation, a huge amount of variability within the given organism. And within a population, so a group of those organisms, certain ones will be, they're all different. And given at that point in time, when reproduction occurs and offspring are given off, those who happen at that point in time to have the correct suite of characters will be selected for. So it's an ongoing process. It didn't just happen to create new species. It occurs all the time. It's not just a speciation event.
The final...
I think the main concern I have with the program is that it frames the issue in a falsely dichotomous way. It presents the only critics of Darwinism as biblical literalists. You'll see that tonight in the final episode. And it excludes both dissenting scientific opinion and facts that challenge Darwinism. And so there's a lot that's pushed aside, swept under the rug. You get the idea of just two sides, biblical literalism versus science, science versus religion, and you're missing the dissenting scientific opinion that's out there.
Carol, 30 seconds.
I would like people to realize that evolution and religion are not at all incompatible, and that evolution has tremendous predictive power that's used every day in biomedical research.